teacher seeks pupil, must have an earnest desire to save the world. Apply in person. So begins the novel Ishmael by Daniel Quinn. Ishmael is a powerful book, and it's a strange book. It questions some of our most basic assumptions. It's imaginative, mythical, but also systematic and practical. Since 1992, it's been read by millions of people and published in over 30 languages. Most importantly, and most impossible to quantify, it has fundamentally changed people. It's expanded their minds, given them new meaning. It certainly has for me. And who knows, maybe one day in the distant future, when our culture ends its war on the world, and future generations are able to live in balance with what Ishmael calls the community of life, this strange, powerful book will have had a part to play in it. Welcome to episode 8 of Human Nature Odyssey, a podcast investigating where these strange ideas come from. I'm Alex Leff. I wanted to ask you, because Ishmael begins with the narrator finding an ad in the paper, Teacher Seeks Pupil, but in real life, Ishmael, the book, also began in a way with finding an ad in the paper, but it was you who found it. How did you come across it, and what was the ad?
Yeah, we were living in Austin, and I was working for a publishing company, Holt, Reinhardt, and Winston, and I just finished a big project and had this stack of magazines on my desk waiting, for me to go through it. I was flipping through, I think it was Publishers Weekly. I always start from the back of the magazines, running down the classified ads, and saw this little ad announcing the Turner Award. I read that, and I immediately got in the car and went home for lunch and said, "Here, look at this."
If you happen to have a copy of Ishmael and you open to one of the very first pages, you'll see the dedication for Rennie. Rennie MacKay Quinn is a writer, painter, and the wife of Daniel Quinn of 45 years before Daniel's passing in 2018. In many ways, without Rennie, Ishmael would not have been possible. When I first started working on this podcast, I could have only dreamed I'd get a chance to talk with her, but as you'll soon hear, dreams are worth following. So in this very special episode, Rennie joins us for her first ever interview, sharing untold stories, new insights, and reflections on her life and journey with her beloved late husband, Daniel Quinn. So without any further ado, here is my conversation with Rennie MacKay Quinn. I only recently learned, I think in the new intro that you sent me, the interesting symmetry of you kind of finding something in the classified ad and that starting this Ishmael adventure. I just loved the symmetry with the narrator finding the ad in the book, starting his own adventure too. I was wondering, do you think that...
Oh, I hadn't even thought of that before. That hadn't occurred to me that there was a symmetry there. No, but that's true, yeah.
Do you still have the ad? Could you read what it says?
Okay, what it says in the press release here was the literary competition created by Turner just 18 months ago was designated to encourage authors throughout the world to write original works of fiction with creative and positive solutions to global problems.
You saw this in the classified, and was there part of you that was like, I wonder if it would be right to apply for this? Or did you feel pretty certain, like, I have to bring this?
No, this was just, my reaction was immediate. Oh, this is what we've been waiting for. I took off at lunchtime and took it to our apartment and shoved it in Dan's face and said, "Here." I mean, it wasn't more than 6 weeks before the deadline. We didn't know what was going to happen, but it was certainly worth a shot. And the odd thing is, now I have found things. I have found magazines that we had that had earlier announcements of this thing, and we
No
just
way.
never noticed it before. No. And so if I hadn't just finished my project, if I hadn't had this stack of magazines on my desk, and if I hadn't just started flipping from the back, I never would have found it.
Wow.
The whole thing was, you might say, providential.
There's a lot of questions I have, and we'll get into the background that led to that moment. But first, I wanted to kind of zoom out from that, because that was published in 1992, the year before I was born. And 14 years after that, I was preparing for my summer vacation and told I had to read this book. And it was the last thing in the world that I wanted to do, was read a book. But it ended up, like it has for so many people, really deeply and profoundly impacting me. And, growing up in the 21st century, finding out that glaciers are disappearing just as I'm learning that something called a glacier even exists, was really terrifying in many ways. And Ishmael didn't alleviate any of that terror, but it provided a lot of clarity. And I've always felt, since reading that there was a reason, a framework for why this was happening, and maybe even how we could change it. And I've always wanted to do something about this and didn't know what. And after all these years, it's turned into this podcast. And I went to ishmael.org and figured I wanted to share it with whoever was managing the website. I didn't know who that was, and I submitted it. And I, to my great surprise, received an email back from you, and was probably one of the coolest emails I've ever gotten, to get an email from you appreciating it, and really grateful to have gotten to connect with you and get to talk with you again today.
Well, it's been great. This has been just fun and exciting for me to talk with you and be involved in this too, and involved in what you're doing. This is the thing that Daniel wanted, was for people to do what they can do, whatever they feel like doing, that emerges from their experience with Ishmael. Rather than, a lot of people have written to him and say, what can I do? What can I do? And they want to be told what to do. And that's not what he was about, telling people what to do. So you're doing it.
Well, I wanted to ask you, kind of zooming out very far, I'm curious, what was your greatest dream as a child? What did you hope for your life?
Well, I grew up in the 50s, got out of high school in 1955. I was living in a small town. We'd moved from Canada back to my mother's home in South Dakota, and it was like a town of like 300 people. And there were 13 kids in my graduating class in high school. And I had not ever read a biography before. I had to read one for an English class, and I read one about Ralph Bunche, who was UN at that time. And at that point, I realized what I wanted. I mean, when I grew up, what you did, you went to school, you were lucky if you went to college, and then you got married and had children. Well, I didn't really want children, but I figured getting married was part of the way life went. But I wanted to marry someone. I wanted to marry a man who was going to do something important. I had just read this biography of a man who had done something very important. That's what I wanted. I always had that in the back of my mind. But when I met Dan, I had no idea that was what was going to happen. That was just, neither one of us had any idea this was going to happen.
I know that Daniel mentions the 60s and Ishmael and some of his other books as this really big turning point. And I'm curious, like, what it was from your perspective, what was changing and what it was like for you.
In the 60s, there was freedom. I graduated from college in 1959, and I got a job teaching in California. Well, to go from the Midwest to California, that in itself was liberating. I mean, that was a whole new world. But then the 60s began, there was the civil rights movement. There was all kinds of stuff going on. And everybody was tuning in and dropping out and doing drugs, none of which I did. But it was, all the restrictions were gone. Then there were the beginning of the women's, Betty Friedan and all of this was just new stuff. I was single, I was young, I was living in Chicago. It was fun. My family was in newspaper publishing, so I'd grown up in the newspaper business. So publishing was kind of a natural thing. For me, I was a lit major, an English major. When I met Dan, I ended up freelancing, writing educational materials. I wrote for radio. That's what I was doing. I had been writing for a book that he was editing. So I knew him. And Thornby's had a big Christmas party every year for all their freelance help. I decided I was going to go to that party. I didn't like going to parties, but I wanted someone to, invite me to dinner afterwards. That was my goal. But I got stuck at the fruit table with this guy. I kept trying to get over to the side of the room where the other editors were and where Daniel was. But then he came up to me and he said, "Would you like to go get a hamburger?" So we escaped.
All the times I've seen him in interviews and images, probably all post Ishmael. And so I'm trying to imagine how young you guys were. How old were you both at that time? And
at that time, that was 1972. I would have been 30. I think I was 33. And he's 3 years older than I am. So he would have been 35.
What do you remember first drawing you to him?
Well, when I met him and, was being interviewed, talking to him about what I was going to be doing, I was scared to death of him. He was the editor. He was the executive editor. I was having to write stuff and deliver it to him. It was work. I remember wondering if he was married. I remember that. But other than that, didn't have much contact with him until that evening.
Right. And then so there you are having your hamburgers. What do you think drew him to you? And not even just necessarily initially, because it sounds like for you, you just wanted to have a hamburger and have it not be with the shrimp guy. But
Yeah, right.
But as you both started dating and as it was romantic and becoming partners, like what do you think in those first days was drawing you to each other?
Well, okay, I will tell you this, and he doesn't tell this, but we were sitting waiting for our hamburgers, and we were in a booth, and he was sitting across from me in the booth. And suddenly, he just looked at me and he said, "I'm already 3/4 in love with you."
No
and I
way.
said, no, you can't do that. My answer to any first thing is always no. So we went on from there. None of that is public yet.
So at any of those points, did you find yourself thinking like, this is the person did you remember that vision you had as a little girl?
No, that didn't even come into it at all. It's odd, but I didn't even think of that. It wasn't until much later that I realized. It wasn't until years later, and it was in 1976, and we were standing waiting for a cab, and it was winter outside. It was, late. We closed down our favorite restaurant, so we were just waiting for a cab. And Dan told me the stories of his experience at Gethsemane and the dream that he had, the beetle dream. This is all the stuff that he's put in Providence.
So a couple years after Ishmael, Daniel Quinn published Providence, an autobiography of sorts, and in it he tells the story of this dream he had when he was just 6 years old, where this mysterious tree falls down and blocks his path, and little Daniel could see that it had fallen from a long way away, outside of the city, from a forest. And along the trunk came scurrying what Quinn called a great black beetle, who came from that faraway forest and spoke to him telepathically. The beetle told Daniel he was needed back where the trunk came from. Here's what Quinn wrote. The beetle said to him, quote, "Well, I'll be there, waiting for you." He went on and then paused as if thinking about how to explain. "You need to know some things, you see, if you're going to help us. We need to tell you the secret of our lives." Unquote.
He'd never told me that before. He'd never told anybody those things before. I heard those stories and I immediately said, "You've got to do something with those. You can't let go of those." It wasn't long after that he began working on what ultimately became Ishmael.
Wow.
But before that, we were just scraping along. He quit his job because of the president's edict that we should stop making things for kids that were so good because they were only kids after all. He didn't need to be. So that was the end of that.
So the president of the publishing club had given him a hard time for writing with such high quality with the kids' books that was, or
Well, this was another company that he was working for at the time. He was the editorial director of this. And they were making wonderful products for primary kids, and Dan wrote most of them, but they had college professors' names on them. These are for first, second, and third graders. Huge modules with film strips and games and all kinds of things. And they won all kinds of awards, and they were this major educational publisher. There was a new president. He was in it for, we got to show profits. We have to show we can't do this. We can't. So, okay, well, we'll just make our own products and sell them to people. We did. We had our own little company. We were making educational products. That's what we did until we discovered that wasn't what we should be doing either. So we did not do things the way people usually do. They get jobs, and we didn't think anything about just quitting something and starting something. We always do things like that. Well, let's do this.
It sounds like you were both a really good team, kind of encouraging and enabling each other to take those risks and live a more unconventional life.
Well, yeah, we were. And of course, I was been freelancing, and that's a pretty precarious thing to do.
I can relate.
Yeah, right. And then it's time to get out of Chicago. And so where should we go? And we ended up in New Mexico.
Was it you that had a vision of the desert or wanted to retreat?
Yeah, it's very biblical to go to the desert and find your way. And we wanted to get out of a city, and we knew, we'd already lived in the Midwest and farming territory, and we didn't want that. And we certainly didn't want to be in Texas. And
would you say with irony as you live there right now?
Yeah, right. The desert was all that was left. And so that's where we ended up. And ultimately in a former ghost town midway between Santa Fe and Albuquerque called Madrid, which was populated by people just like us, a little weird and strange, who wanted to do what they wanted to do. It was kind of wide open.
And what year was that? So
we moved to New Mexico in 1980. We were there. Chicago was the 70s. New Mexico was pretty much the 80s. Then Austin in the 90s and Houston in the 2000s.
Interesting.
So we kind of had 4 places that were our geographic locations.
Yes, you were nomadic.
Nomadic, yes.
So in 1975 or 76, you said he mentioned these childhood memories and how they impacted him to you, and you encouraged him to write about them. And then 15 years later is when Ishmael gets written, but it's my understanding there's many versions that exist and evolve in between. What was that process like? How many versions, how many books did he write in between?
1976 is when the very first version was done, and it was done very fast. He didn't know what he was getting into either when he started out. And that went to several publishers and several agents and got turned down.
That first version that he published, it wasn't called Ishmael. There wasn't that gorilla.
Nothing was published before Ishmael. None of it was published. The first versions, some of them didn't even get finished. Some of them didn't get sent. That's why we went to New Mexico, partly because we needed to get out of Chicago. He was at a point. He needed some other environment to work in.
So he's working on these different drafts and versions over a course of a decade. And I'm curious what he expressed about these ideas to you while working on these books. Like, was it part of everyday conversation, or did he keep it to himself until it was ready?
No, we didn't have everyday conversation about this stuff, but I typed all these manuscripts. When he started out, he was writing everything by hand on yellow line paper with a black flare pen. He never talked about what he was writing about. He wrote it, and then he gave it to me to type, to get my reaction to it. So I had to learn how to react to something just as a reader. And it took me a while to do it. But when I was typing, I read everything. And when I did the first versions, I thought he was going to get struck down by lightning coming from the sky if he didn't watch out, because I'd never heard anything like this before. And I didn't know what to make of it either. What he was doing was entirely new to me. There's
part of you that felt like these ideas were blasphemous in a way. Is that what you
Well, I thought they were, they were radical. I didn't know what was going on here. Yeah. So it wasn't until I think it was the third version which was called The Book of Nahash.
Mm-hmm.
And the Book of Nahash was a retelling of the Genesis story, really. And of course, this I knew. I'd grown up with this. This was a whole new look at what had been my world. That got to me, and that was when I began finally to tune into what was going on here, because that I could relate to, and that affected me. I never had the experience that all the rest of you and others have all had with Ishmael, but I had it with that. That was my epiphany, sort of.
One of the dismissals, the rejections that a publisher gave him, calling the book unpublishable.
Right.
And it's just, in a way, it's funny to read that now, knowing how it all ended up. But also, it's just, I can't imagine persevering, working on this after all these rejections. What was that like?
Oh, it's terrible. And I have that right here. That was not Ishmael, of course, and that was called Another Story to Be In. That's what people were turning down, and it was unpublishable in that form because it didn't have what Ishmael has, which is Ishmael.
Mm.
The agent didn't think that anybody cared about this stuff anymore, which shows how dumb he was. I mean, he wasn't dumb; he was a high-powered agent, but he didn't understand what was going on with people in the world in this. He just didn't think people cared about this stuff anymore.
Right.
The world and what's going to happen to it. That was completely wrong. But yeah, no, that was devastating.
Would Daniel express self-doubt? How did he take these rejections?
He got depressed. He went through a lot of depression. One day, he threw away 1,000 pages of manuscript, handwritten manuscript. I thought that drove me crazy.
He didn't think it was worthwhile.
No, right, no. But he kept on going. It didn't stop him from trying the next thing. He always tried the next thing.
And he credits you as encouraging him that he'll find a way. Why did you believe in him? How did you find that encouragement?
Well, I knew that he would. I mean, I knew this was important. This was our life's work. I mean, we did a lot of other stuff. In New Mexico, we started a weekly newspaper and covered a territory the size of Rhode Island, and that was great. We did all these other things that kept us going. But this was always at the heart of it. Once Dan started on this mission, really, it was his work to do. It consumed our lives. And the rest was just stuff we could do to keep alive. And some of it was fun. Most of it was fun. And but this was the driving force, always, Walter. And I understood this because I'd been around this. I'd been around missionaries and people who do this, and people have causes, and people who are doing stuff like this. So I understood it. But the thing is that I got to do everything that I wanted to do. I'd always wanted to have my own newspaper. We did that. We both got to do other things that we wanted to do because we were always in it together. And it's partly because we did the same stuff. We were writers. That's what we did. I don't know many people who can, couples who can live together 24 hours a day and, not go crazy. But that we did. We always were working at home. We were always doing stuff jointly. We just had something that was unique to us. And I couldn't have been the kind of wife I envisioned back in the 50s. That was not it.
Well, and so now I'm curious about life once Ishmael exists. So we talked about how you find Ted Turner's ad in the newspaper or in the classifieds and you submit it. And do you remember the moment you heard that Ishmael won?
Yes. There was no indication when this announcement would come. So we sort of just put it at the back because you can't go around thinking about that for 6 months. We were in Austin. This was a Mother's Day in May in 1991. We had our favorite bar that we would go to, the Cedar Door. We'd go down there on Sunday afternoons, and we had just come home, and Dan was down in the parking lot putting oil in the car, which was falling apart. And I had gone up the stairs to a third floor apartment, and I heard the phone ring. I dashed in to get the phone, answered it. And this guy on the phone says, "Is Daniel Quinn there?" He gave me his name from Turner Publishing. "I want to talk to Daniel Quinn." And it didn't register with me at all because
Really?
Dan had been waiting he'd applied for some freelance thing with somebody and he was expecting a call back from this guy. I thought, well, that's who this is. So I called down to him to come up. He answered the phone and, oh yeah, you have just won this $500,000 award and the judges would like you to come to New York tomorrow so they can meet you.
Oh my God.
It was just crazy. And I said, a plane ticket will be waiting for you at the Austin airport tomorrow. Be there. And it was a shock. It was bizarre. And so he flew to New York. We walked into the room to meet the judges. And that was when Ray Bradbury came and met him at the door and shook his hand and said, will there be a son of Ishmael? And Dan said no. But of course,
there were more books to come after all.
There were more books to come after all, yeah.
That initial reaction to Ishmael, once it's released and the popularity of it, and just there's people reaching out and, celebrities are hearing about it and reaching out to you.
Well, first of all, it was in June at the big event in New York where they had the big banquet and they gave out the award and had the press conference and all that stuff. The announcements got made and there was a lot of talk about that. Then it was in the papers. And then we got the phone calls and interviews and things like that. It was hectic.
Yeah. For me, reading this, I was really interested in the life of Daniel Quinn through Providence and stuff later on. But initially, I almost wanted to keep him as this mythical figure, So when I was a teenager, did he feel the tension of people wanting the answers of what to do with their lives? And how did he navigate that?
Well, once that started happening, it's sort of like, this is the first podcast I've ever done. You learn by doing things.
Totally.
And he had to learn how to do all this stuff. He had to learn how to do interviews. He hadn't done this. He'd been secluded. He had to give speeches. He had to do these kinds of things. And gradually it gets easier and easier and easier because it's happened you've done it so many times. One of the first things after this all came out in Austin, he was invited to speak to a book club. I think it was a book club, but it was in somebody's house. And, they'd read all this stuff in the newspapers. So we went there and we're sitting around in a circle. And it's like they were expecting Ishmael to show up. And Daniel Quinn showed up. And they didn't know what to make of it, because he's not that imposing. We sort of thought they expected him to show up in a gorilla suit. It's like, and so they were disappointed. And we had a bunch of strange things like that, especially right at the beginning. But then, interestingly, as time went on, Dan grew into being Ishmael. It was kind of his alter ego, but it was a process because at first, he was just Daniel Quinn.
No, it's true. And it makes sense also that it's one thing to write this book in this inclusion and you can really think about what you're going to say. He really is someone who was so careful about how to express these complex ideas, wanting his words to be meaningful. I know even for myself, it's I'm much more eloquent about this in the podcast than I could possibly be, just talking to someone in conversation. So I can imagine being in this position where people are asking questions that maybe he hadn't quite been ready to articulate yet, or putting this pressure on. It seems like it's a lot to navigate.
Yes, it is. And he did it ultimately. One of his favorite thing to do, though, he did a lot of this in Houston, and especially, later on, because he could sit in his favorite chair, which is relax the back chair, which I'm sitting in now, actually. And
wow.
I think we have a picture on the website of the last picture, one of the few pictures that we have of us, and he's sitting in that chair. It was his chair that we had that from Austin days. But then he could sit in his chair with the phone and talk to classes, and they could ask their questions. And this happened with schools all over the country. That was something he really enjoyed because he was having a dialogue. He might prefer to do that rather than just making a speech or something, because the most fun for him at any kind of speech making that he had to do was the Q&A section afterwards, because then he was interacting with people and not just making a speech.
Mm-hmm. I think that's one of the things that's so powerful about Ishmael is that it's written in this conversation.
It is, yes. initially, the first edition of Ishmael had a post office box in them. And Dan had just put that in. We didn't know what was going to happen. I mean, we have letters, 3 big file drawers full of those, plus boxes of letters. We got so many letters. And the beginning, when we were Austin, they were all filed. Dan answered everything.
Was there anyone that Daniel had really admired that read Ishmael and reached out? Was there someone that he was most kind of like, wow, I can't believe this person just reached out to me?
Pete Seeger. Do you know who Pete Seeger is?
Yeah, absolutely.
Some people from your generation don't.
For folks who don't know, so he's a folk singer.
Folk singer. There was a handwritten letter from him, signed with a little banjo.
No way. Oh my God.
He was the outstanding one, because we both had that experience of that was our introduction to folk music when we were in college. That was just the beginning of that era. Ultimately moved into the 60s.
Right, because he's an incredible musician as well as someone who has really walked the walk and pushed for social change and an activist in many ways too. Yeah.
He and Dan had carried on quite a correspondence for a number of years.
Do you have those letters?
I do have those.
Oh my God, those letters need to be published. That is ridiculous. It's amazing.
Yeah, for us, that was a big deal.
One question I had about this all, Ishmael is talking about these new categories and new ways to understand the world, takers and leavers, and what do we do with all this? And I had a friend who really earnestly was like, I believe in what Ishmael is talking about and appreciating the leaver mindset and enacting the story that we belong into the world. But she's like, but it's so hard because here I am in taker culture and I'm still consuming every day. And she was wondering what it was like with Daniel sharing these ideas still in our culture, how to live with that cognitive dissonance about wanting another world to be possible while still living in this one. I'm curious what he thought about that and what you think about that.
Well, I don't know. There are a lot of things that have changed that people are aware of that has an effect, I think. You have a mindset. It's how you perceive things for yourself. You can't determine how anybody else is going to live. You just have to do what you want. It's more in your approach to life, I think. Everybody has their own take on this, how to live and what to do. And I've gotten letters from people who are just now discovering Ishmael. I mean, it's been around for 30 years, but they're like you, they're younger, and they're even younger. They think, wow, and what they're finding is that it is, except for the things that have changed that are outdated, it applies as much to what's going on now as it did then. And some say even more so. I mean, I get some treatises from people who tell me how much this changed, but it's personal. But you can't turn it into a Bible. Some people have tried to do that. They've misinterpreted all over the place.
One of the main points that I always appreciated is that the whole point is there's no one right way to live.
That's right. There is no one right way to live. And, that's hard for people to understand who are busy preaching the one way. Ishmael, it finds its people.
Let me know if this is prying too much, but, I know he had been ill for some time before he passed away in 2018. And I wanted to ask you, this is someone who has impacted me so much and I never got to meet. And it means so much to get to talk with you. And I'm curious what it was like towards the end of his life and what was happening and what it was like when he passed away for you.
Well, with that, he had no famous last words. That's what you're trying to get at. Yeah, no, it was hard. One of the pictures that's on the website, the one I told you about, it's the last picture. Well, we have very few, but it is the last picture that was taken. It was taken in beginning of January, just a month before he died. And it was taken by a friend of ours. We had lunch with her. And we went back to our apartment, and Dan is sitting in his chair, and I'm sitting on the edge. It's a very lovely picture. And it's just kind of, he just had been fading slowly.
Yeah. I mean, you two had, and stop me if this is too much, but I'm just thinking about, I lost my grandparents last year. You spend so much time with someone and they're able to share so much with you. And then at a certain point, it's like what was shared is what you hold on to. And just thinking about in terms of how close you both were and are and the profound partnership that you had, and just wondering what it's been like for you as you've transitioned into this new chapter.
I don't know. It's kind of hard to say now. I think different people adjust different ways. It's interesting now because where I'm living, I mean, people are dying every day, and there's someone just down the hall from me died the other day, and death becomes something that is very commonplace. It's very real, and and everybody's very aware of it. We talk about when we're going to die, how long, how much, how much longer do I have to, do what I'm doing? It becomes a normal part of life. My life is just to be aware of this, which when you experience it firsthand for the first time, it's different. And I had gone through the death of my father, and that was a whole different thing when my mother had died. And there were people who had died around me, but relatives and all that kind of stuff. But it wasn't the same. It wasn't the same for me as it is for other people that I've talked to. The one thing that happened, and this happened every time that Dan was in a hospital. We'd had a bad fall in 2016, which was kind of the beginning, and he had a fractured hip. And the emergency room doctor saw the wristband, Daniel Quinn, and he said, "Are you the Daniel Quinn who wrote Ishmael?"
No way.
Like, yes. Well, okay. So then he came in with his coterie of doctors behind him, and he said, "I've got everybody reading Ishmael now." And that happened in the hospital the last days. And somehow somebody, and we don't know who, made it known that he was Daniel Quinn and he'd written Ishmael. And, his treatment suddenly got much better, but we had books, and he was going to sign books for the doctors, and he always enjoyed that. He enjoyed having people find out that, yeah, I'm that one you're thinking of. That happened.
I mean, he got to experience something that I think, very few people ever get to experience, which is having, I was about to say dream, but yeah, literally a dream that he had as this child.
Yeah.
And with your encouragement and love and support, working on this, being rejected, persevering, publishing something, sharing it, and many books to follow, and getting to live to see just how profoundly the dream came true, that he was sharing this with people and that people were really touched by it. And that's something few people get to experience, I think.
Right. We had no idea. Of course, we were in educational publishing. We wrote things for kids. And the one thing he had wanted to do was to make things that were good for kids and interesting and high quality and make a difference in the education system. Well, he couldn't do that under ordinary circumstances working within it. But what was amazing to us was when the school started picking up Ishmael, and Ishmael became a part of, from sixth grade on up through college courses, as bizarre as history of the opera. Anybody who read Ishmael, who was a teacher, found a way to use it in their class. That was the most amazing thing for him. The thing that he was most pleased with was to have that happen. It wasn't that it changed anything in the schools, but it's that a lot of kids' lives were changed because of that book.
I can say so from personal experience.
Yeah.
You are working on your own book right now.
Yes, I am. I've told some of it here, but it's basically it's the Dan and Rennie story. Daniel, I have to say Daniel and Rennie story. It's our life. What I'm doing now is not publishable. I'm just getting the story told. And then I'll have to go back in and see what it's all about. But I have a lot of material. I have letters. I've got notebooks full of dreams. we were both big on dreams. So, of course, Daniel's first novel was called Dreamer. A few of the dreams in that are from actual dreams, ours. So, but I have, starting from the 70s on, a lot of that comes in because they're crucial to what was going on. It's kind of a cross between a memoir and a biography.
We'll
very
see what happens.
I have to live long enough to finish it.
Hopefully it's not the same amount of time that it took Ishmael to be born.
It won't be that long.
That's very exciting. To go back to the very first thing we talked about in terms of being raised in the 50s and having these different expectations and imagining that, well, maybe you can marry someone who did something important, and now really having your story be told as part of this and seeing how completely vital you are as part of this creation that has impacted so many people. It's very exciting that you're telling this story, and I'm excited to read it.
It is true. And as Dan said, in various places, if it hadn't been for me, there wouldn't have been this book, partly because I was the one who told him to do something with those things, but also partly because nobody else would have put up with it. And that's true. It needed both of us to do this, really.
I'm going to stop myself because I could go on forever and there's infinite more, but I am so grateful for you taking the time to talk.
No, I'm glad you wrote and that, we've had all this going on. It's fun. This whole thing with you is fun because it's like I'm now experiencing the fun things that Dan experienced when he first heard from somebody that he got really excited about or who was really excited about his book. Now, especially with this interview, it's like I'm part of this now. I'm part of what you're doing. And I like that.
I am curious. I mean, this is, I guess, my last question. Just this might be a little vain because I am asking this while it's being recorded. But you sent me this really nice email about how it was for you to listen to that first episode, and I'm curious, like, what it was like for you to listen to this podcast from this random young guy who read Ishmael all those years ago.
Well, it was amazing. I was startled. Your podcast is not like any of the other podcasts I've listened to. But I'm not a podcast person, but it's partly the music. It's a production. It's a story. You're telling it. It's fun. It's interesting. It's got personality. It's exciting. Part of what I like about what you're doing is that it is so good. What you're doing is so good. And it's nice for me to see somebody doing something that is on a level that Dan would appreciate.
Wow.
I don't know if that's what you meant by your question.
No. Well, I was putting you on the spot. I really appreciate that. And I'm grateful that we're both getting to connect in this way. I'm glad that I waited. I know I'm still young in the grand scheme of things, but I'm glad that I waited to work on this podcast and worked on some other things first, because I feel like I only now feel ready to have created this podcast at this point. So I'm glad that if I had made something when I was 14, having first listened to it, would not have been as good.
No.
It needed to take some time.
No, the timing is good. Really, I think, people don't knowing how to do anything till they're at least in their 30s. But then, I was in my 30s before I knew anything, and even then, I didn't really know anything until I was much older than that. So
you're saying that the podcast will get better over time?
It may be different, but you've got the basics, and now you can just go on and keep improving and keep adding to it and doing what you want and making the who knows what you'll do.
And with that, we conclude the first season of Human Nature Odyssey. Thank you so much to Rennie for joining us and sharing these stories. And there's actually much more to this conversation, and you can find it on our Patreon and hear the rest of Rennie's stories there. There's a lot of really great parts that couldn't fit into one episode, so if you're interested, make sure to check it out. And hey, thank you for listening. It's been quite a ride this year, exploring Ishmael together. Our adventure is far from over, though. In the next season of Human Nature Odyssey, with Ishmael's framework as our guide, we will continue on our quest through new lands and new ideas. If you're enjoying the podcast, please share it with a friend, your grandma, your life insurance agent, Follow us on social media and subscribe wherever you enjoy your podcasts. Season 2 will begin next spring. In the meantime, the podcast will be taking a seasonal hibernation so I can make those episodes as special, meaningful, and cinematic as this season. I've already gotten started, and truly, I think you're really going to like it. But if you're thinking, oh no, there'll be nothing to listen to all winter long, well, don't you worry. On the contrary, our Patreon will be chock full of all sorts of good stuff. Most excitingly, each month we'll release a new exclusive episode of conversations with other guests. In these bonus episodes you can only find on Patreon, we'll talk about exploring abandoned ruins, speculate what the future of our civilization will look like, get to the bottom of why some can't stop thinking about the Roman Empire, and much more. And one of my favorite parts of the Patreon, in addition to it helping make the show possible, is hearing from people listening and discussing these ideas together. So I hope to see you there. Our theme music is Celestial Soda Pop by Lynch. You can find a link in our show notes. And let me just say, because we've been using this theme song all season, thank you so much to Ray and Kathleen Lynch for letting us use it. And I highly recommend checking out Ray Lynch's music. It's an incredible soundtrack for life. And thank you to the people who suggested some of the questions I asked Rennie: Susan, Leslie, Michael, and Jesse. Talk to you all soon.